name is Jennifer Falkoski. I have a master's in organizational leadership. I am currently a doctoral candidate in the School of Organizational Leadership at the University of the Rockies in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I am here today to share my dissertation research with you that I will be defending in 2 weeks. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I have over the last year or so. For my dissertation, I decided to look at 3 crucial concepts that I believe exist in organizations that are not necessarily integrated wholly into the organization. Those are burnout, coping, and employee engagement. These are not new concepts to the field, but what I try to do is integrate my findings into an overarching model of cultural resiliency. I picked high-risk occupations because I believe that employees who work in high-risk occupations are more prone to trauma or crisis, and therefore the way they cope, the way burnout affects them, that obviously affects their engagement and has a large impact on the organization overall. I decided to limit my sample size to looking at medical professionals and mental health professionals. Now, obviously, there are other areas of high-risk occupations like police and firemen, but I did not include those in my sample. Okay. What I'd like to do is briefly go over the assessments that I used in my research. To assess burnout, I used the Maslow Burnout Inventory, the Human Services Survey. This is a very common assessment used to measure burnout. It's a 22-item self-report measure, so again, all of my assessments are self-reports. I am relying on my participants to be truthful with me of how they're feeling. The data was collected online via SurveyMonkey. It was completely anonymous, so I'm hoping that because the data was confidential and collection was anonymous, that they were indeed truthful about how they're feeling. The MBI has 3 subscales: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. The emotional exhaustion subscale measures feelings of being exhausted and emotionally overextended in the workplace. Now, when we talk about being emotionally exhausted, we're talking about a long-term exhaustion that has happened over a period of years. And burnout is often linked to the general adaptation syndrome theory, which looks at the development of burnout over a 3-phase period. The initial alarm phase, the resistance phase, and then the exhaustion phase. And this usually happens over a period of years. This is why I looked into high-risk occupations, because I believe that the amount of time it takes an employee to become burned out in a high-risk occupation is significantly less than someone who does not work in a high-risk occupation. For example, social workers have about 3 to 5 year burnout rate before they just say, that's it, I can't take it, and I have to get out. And what we're seeing is a lot of turnover. And so what I'm trying to do is provide companies with some sort of strategy of how they can try to help employees decrease their risk to burnout, so to speak, so that they can maintain these employees longer in their careers, and thus you don't experience as much turnover, because there's a lot of issues with having to rehire, train, etc. The depersonalization subscale assesses how an employee feels about the people that they work with, whether those are colleagues, supervisors, subordinates, or recipients. So if someone is showing high depersonalization, they're not really feeling connected to the people they work with. They feel kind of impersonal, kind of this out-of-body experience in the workplace, and they become detached. The personal accomplishment scale measures feelings of successful accomplishment and competence in the workplace. So a high score on the personal accomplishment scale is a good thing. Employee engagement was measured using the Q12 survey published by the Gallup poll. This is, as I understand it, the most frequently used assessment to look at employee engagement. Although it's called the Q12, there are actually 13 questions. The first is just a question that tries to get at overall job satisfaction. So overall, how do you feel about the place that you work? All of these questions are rated on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, with 1 being completely disagree and 5 being completely agree. The first question asks participants or employees about, do you have clear expectations of what you are responsible for in the workplace? It's hard to do your job if you don't know what's expected of you. And to follow that up, do you have the resources you need to do your job effectively? And that is the responsibility of the organization, to provide those expectations and resources to their employees. Also, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best? Sometimes there is not a goodness of fit in employees. They're in a position that they might not like or they might not be well equipped to perform. In the last 7 days, have you received any type of recognition or praise for your work? Now, this is an extrinsic motivator, something that we get from someone else, and this could come from a colleague, a supervisor, or even a subordinate, or a recipient, in this case, a patient. Do you feel that someone cares about you at your work? So in other words, if you started, to have a heart attack and drop dead, would somebody pay attention and care about that? Or do you just feel like you're a cog in the wheel, so to speak? Professional development is crucial in employee engagement. Employees don't like to feel like they're stagnant, like they're stuck in a position. And professional growth is key to maintaining employee engagement and increasing what the employee can give back to the organization. Do my opinions matter? That's also important. If an employee feels like they aren't being heard, they're less likely to positively contribute. It's also important that the employee understand how their job specifically addresses and helps the organization achieve its mission and vision. If they're clueless of what they're doing, of how that contributes to the organization, they're not really going to understand how important they are and how important their position is. It's also important to feel like your colleagues are committed to doing quality work, and this is seen in a lot of team-based work. It's important to feel that you're putting your best foot forward and all the people you work with are putting your best foot forward. We tend to see in teams a little bit of social loafing. So most of the people in the team are doing their job, doing what's expected of them, but tends to be a couple of people who just sit back and let everybody else do all the work and then take the credit. Best friend at work is one of the most important predictors of employee engagement, second to a good relationship with your supervisor. So if you have a friend that you trust in an organization that you can talk to, it's going to increase engagement. Progress is also important. Are you making progress in your job? Meaning, are you moving forward with your performance objectives? And are you making progress within the organization? And finally, the last question that the Q12 addresses is an opportunity to learn and grow. So this is more of an intrinsic motivator. Again, we don't like to feel too stagnant, and this will depend on the job category as well. The third assessment I used is the COPE dispositional inventory. I used the abbreviated version, which has 28 items. The full version has 60. And I elected to use the abbreviated version because I was already asking my participants to fill out a demographic survey and the MASLOC and the employee engagement, and I didn't want them sitting at their computer for an hour. So I decided to scale it down, use the abbreviated version. It has 14 subscales: self-distraction, active coping, which takes a more proactive response, like I am actively trying to do something about any type of issue that they may see in the workplace. Denial, substance use, use of emotional support, and use of instrumental support. These sound very similar, and in fact they are. However, use of emotional support is the utilization of people that you have very close to you, kind of the key figures in your life. To most of us, this constitutes friends and family. Instrumental support represents a proactive stance to reach out into the community and find support. So this could be an EAP in the workplace, it could be a counselor, or reaching out to someone at work that you may not know to try to get advice, professional guidance, or maybe just someone to listen. Behavioral disengagement is another scale on the COPE. And behavioral disengagement represents a clinical phenomenon called learned helplessness. So this is when people just stop trying to resolve a situation in their life. They've resigned themselves that no matter what I do, nothing will change, so I might as well stop trying. Venting refers to, with regard to this assessment only, an expression of negative feelings to another person. Positive reframing refers to reframing maladaptive cognitions into adaptive cognitions. And in order to do that, you first have to be able to identify maladaptive cognitions. Planning, humor, acceptance, religion, and self-blame are the other scales on this inventory. I also wanted to look at workplace motivators. My hypothesis was that workplace motivators would vary by job category. And in the research that I've done, I found that motivation tends to be kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. Most organizations rely heavily on extrinsic motivators to motivate their workforce. What I wanted to see is if employee-preferred workplace characteristics would vary by job category. So, for instance, in a normal hierarchical job chart where you have several different levels, I hypothesized that workplace motivators would vary by level and what type of work the employee was doing. I elected to use Herzberg's workplace motivators. These include achievement, recognition and reward, nature of the work itself, responsibility, advancement, professional growth, company policy and administration, relationship with your supervisor, colleagues, and subordinates, in addition to salary, status, and security and safety. Now, security and safety has a dual meaning with regard to my population. First, we all have a need to feel safe in our environment, whether that's in our home or in the workplace. So sometimes, unfortunately, we see disgruntled employees come into an organization and perpetuate violent acts against other employees for whatever reason. It also, in certain industries, workplace safety is crucial for those who are operating heavy machinery. And it also refers to an absence of harassment in the workplace. With regard to a medical setting, it's important that medical waste is disposed of accordingly, that you're not leaving yourself vulnerable to disease and catching infections from patients. So that was a caveat to this research. These are the job categories that I looked at. For the purposes of my dissertation, I separated job categories based on my selected participant sample into two overarching categories: medical and mental health caregivers and administrative and supporting roles. So the medical and mental health caregivers are people who have direct contact with recipients. These are the people who are helping patients, dealing with crises in one way or another. And administrative and supporting roles are exactly what they suggest to be: the executive, managerial teams, in addition to support staff, schedulers, receptionists, other assistants, in addition to those big categories that we see in organizational charts like finance, human resources, and things like that. Okay, I'd like to briefly just go over my research questions prior to sharing the results. Again, I wanted to look at the relationships among burnout, type of coping, and employee engagement. We tend to educate employees in terms of one thing at a time, and I wanted to see if there were any relationships between these variables. Those are the first three research questions. The fourth, like I said, was to try to determine if there were any common themes or patterns that existed between employee-preferred workplace motivators and job category. And then lastly, in what way can all of these four factors be combined to create or foster autonomous resiliency in employees, thereby inherently reinforcing a resilient company culture. Briefly, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about my participant sample. Data was collected from 268 participants actively working in the medical and mental health field. Originally, I used a convenient sample. However, I found as I was disseminating the survey, I was getting a lot of really good feedback, asking permission to disseminate the survey through several other listservs. So in a way, it started as a convenient sample and ended up being kind of a snowball sample. Participants were selected from public outpatient treatment facilities in acute care areas of the medical field, including oncology, emergency care room, cardiac care, the NICU, neonatal intensive care units, and other certified trauma centers. The mental health professionals were anyone who had direct contact with clients, preferably with a license, although I did provide one option on the job category for an unlicensed professional, trying to catch those groups of people who had graduated but weren't licensed yet, but still actively working in the field. Just brief review of the participant demographics. Most of my participants were Caucasian females. The most frequent job category that I found was nurses. Most individuals had a master's degree. And I also threw in a question on my demographic survey addressing how much do you trust the organization you work for? Most likely, if you don't trust the people who are running your company, then you're not going to be very engaged. Most likely, it's going to accelerate your burnout. And depending on the individual, they may or may not be coping with that in an adaptive way. Also, due to the current economic crisis or fallout in the United States, I wanted to throw that in to make sure that my results weren't going to be confounded by the current economic situation. Because it's hard to feel good about your job when you're forced to take a bunch of furlough days because they'd rather do that than have to lay people off, or if you're in fear that you will lose your job. What I found was that 128 people had a moderate amount of trust and 84 had a great deal of trust. So I did not see a significant number of my participants in my sample that expressed extreme distrust in their organization, thankfully. Okay, to the results. In terms of looking at burnout and employee engagement, I found a positive relationship between the personal accomplishment scale and employee engagement. So positive relationship in terms of correlational analysis means that both variables move in the same direction. In other words, as personal accomplishment increases, so does employee engagement. Or, as personal accomplishment decreases, so does employee engagement. I also found a negative relationship between the emotional exhaustion scale on the MBI and employee engagement. In terms of looking at burnout and coping, I did a canonical correlation analysis that looked at the 3 subscales of the Maslow against the 14 subscales of the COPE dispositional inventory. What I found was that there was a positive relationship between the emotional exhaustion scale on the Maslow and the self-distraction, denial, behavioral disengagement, venting, and self-blame scales on the COPE. In addition, there was a positive relationship between the personal accomplishment scale and the emotional support, planning, humor, denial, and substance abuse, or use, on the COPE. And finally, there was a positive relationship between the depersonalization scale and the COPE scales of denial, substance use, emotional support, planning, and humor. Now keep in mind that coping is really an intrapersonal mechanism. Each employee comes into that organization with their own set of coping skills. And what I'm trying to show is that companies need to try to identify what type of coping an employee uses, and if it's deemed to be maladaptive, try to help coach that employee into using more adaptive ways to cope with stressors, both in the workplace, and hopefully they would extrapolate that into their personal lives as well. Continuing with the results on burnout and coping, a negative relationship was shown between personal accomplishment and the COPE scales of instrumental support and behavioral disengagement. A negative relationship illustrates an inverse relationship. So as one variable goes up, the other goes down, or as one goes down, the other goes up. There was also a negative relationship between depersonalization and instrumental support and behavioral disengagement. And finally, the results with regard to coping and employee engagement show that there's a positive relationship between employee engagement and behavioral disengagement, as well as a negative relationship between employee engagement and emotional support. Now to address the fourth research question regarding workplace motivators. Again, I separated it into two overarching groups: medical and mental health caregivers who have primary contact with recipients, and administrative and supporting roles. What I found for the medical and mental health caregivers is that nature of the work was the #1 employee preferred workplace motivator, followed by professional growth, followed by a relationship with peers, and finally salary. In contrast, administrative and supporting roles was a little bit different. Again, we see nature of the work as the #1 employee preferred workplace motivator, followed by responsibility, salary, relationship with peers, and professional growth. It was my overall goal in this research to take the quantitative analysis that I did with those assessments and then create some kind of meaning behind what these things really mean and show organizational leaders a way to apply those concepts in the workplace using a strength-based approach to foster autonomous resiliency in employees. What I have found in my experience is that a lot of leadership development is done very compartmentalized. They talk to you about employee engagement. They talk to you about good leadership. They talk to you about how to get your employees motivated and engaged. But we really need to help people understand how these things are connected. And once they understand how they're connected, then they can truly help employees become more effective and foster resiliency in the workplace. Due to the fact that there is so much literature on culture, it's this wide open topic, and there's hundreds of cultural models out there. My committee and I discussed the importance of identifying some kind of foundational theory that I would use to extrapolate my information. I selected the robust culture model provided by Deal and Kennedy. They've done a lot of work in the last 3 decades on culture. And robust culture is defined as an ideal organizational cultural state that exists when a company communicates its history, identifies and models its core values, develops consistent and shared beliefs, and engages in rituals and ceremonies. So rituals could be employee of the month. Ceremonies could be any type of graduation or certification completion. Also, holiday parties, birthday parties in organizations, those are all examples of rituals and ceremonies. What I aim to do is take a few overarching alignment factors with regard to cultural development and then integrate the information that I gleaned from engagement, burnout, and coping to show people when you look at these overarching cultural strategies, when you break that down, what does that really mean in terms of engagement, burnout, and coping? So the first overarching organizational strategy that I identified was a strength-based micro approach. This has a humanistic orientation that also incorporates a need for safety, a need for belongingness and love, and a need for achievement. And those you might recognize from Maslow's theory. It's my goal to show organizational leaders how to foster autonomous employee resiliency, as this will inherently reinforce a resilient culture on a macro level. Now, keep in mind that culture is still within the system of the organization. So once you go from employee to culture, you then still have to align all the other systems in the organization, in addition to aligning them with the external environment in order for complete alignment to be achieved. It's also important that companies balance intrinsic and extrinsic rewards or motivators. In my experience, I've seen companies overemphasize extrinsic rewards. For example, annual bonuses, certification of appreciation, employee of the month certificate, praise and recognition in the workplace, getting a plaque with your name on it for doing something great in your organization. Although all of these things make us feel good, eventually extrinsic motivators lose their effectiveness in the workplace because employees become habituated to them. And the most common example of this is annual bonuses over the holidays. It's gotten to the point where employees just are like, where's my bonus? I already spent it. I need it. And when people don't get that, what tends to happen? They get angry. They get resentful. I didn't get a bonus this year, and now I dislike the company I work for. Now, I'm not trying to say that employees aren't entitled to extrinsic monetary rewards, but unfortunately, we habituate to these things, and after a while, they lose their effectiveness. And that puts the organization in a really difficult position, because if they take those things away, then they're viewed as this really horrible organization that's taking things away from their employees, yet when they continue to dole them out, they don't have the effect that they originally did, which is to increase employee performance and satisfaction. So therefore, these two types of motivators must be balanced in order for extrinsic rewards to maintain their effectiveness. As I'm sure you've noticed, there's a significant overlap in the characteristics of employee engagement and coping. And again, that's something that I am really striving to illustrate, is that all of these concepts that are applied separately or communicated separately in an organization really have a lot of overlap, and it needs to be looked at in more of a holistic approach. My primary characteristic is to emphasize an overall strength-based approach. What do the employees do well, and how can the organization help that employee grow in those areas, as well as develop skills that they'll need to be effective and competent in their jobs. In order to do this, they have to assess for goodness of fit. What are your skills, and what job will best suit you for that? I'm sure we've all worked in an organization where we've identified at least one employee that is just not effective in their job, and that doesn't mean that they're a bad employee. It just means that they are not really in the right position. So it's the responsibility of the organization to maintain a goodness of fit. The organization also needs to remove organizational barriers for employees. And again, this means giving them the resources they need to do their job effectively, and making sure that they can be effective within their position by effectively communicating those expectations. It's also crucial that the employer seeks to hire employees that have proper value alignment with the organization. So if you don't really care about environmental conservation, then most likely you shouldn't work for a company that strives to do that type of work. Appreciative inquiry is also key. One of the main complaints that organizational leaders have about employee satisfaction surveys is that only the disgruntled employees are going to fill those things out. And we also tend to see that with comment boxes as well, that, you know, when people are mad, that's when they're going to get online and write a review of a really bad meal they had in a restaurant, or, you know, blast the company for something that they perceive to be an injustice. Appreciative inquiry helps the leaders of an organization better effectively communicate with the employees, because they like to hear good things, and that will in turn help them manage the things that need to be improved. Also, a strength-based approach, you have to give employees opportunity to do what they do best. This is an employee engagement characteristic. An opportunity to learn and grow, to make sure that employees are intrinsically motivated by the type of work that they do, and that's what nature of the work refers to. And also, this will help to increase personal accomplishment and satisfies our need to achieve. The second overarching alignment strategy is professional development. This is crucial in an organization and most effectively done through one-on-one employee managerial relationships, as well as engaging in executive coaching. Executive coaching helps people to understand what they're good at. It helps them to reframe things that could potentially be detrimental to their performance in the workplace. It helps them to establish balance in their personal and professional life. And this is something that is not easy because we all take on a lot. And it's an active process. Our lives are dynamic, so we constantly need to assess how we balance the things in our lives. This type of development, executive coaching, will also help the employer understand what really makes that employee tick. What are they really motivated by? And that's what I'm charging companies to do, is you have to work with each individual employee to understand what motivates them and then clear the way so that they can be motivated and do what they do best. Again, this is supported by providing necessary resources, making employees feel like they matter and they're cared about, making sure that they have face time with their supervisor who's talking to them about what they want from this position, and if they want to advance and grow professionally, how can they do that? Also providing opportunities to learn and grow, and fostering the adaptive coping disposition of using emotional and instrumental support. So the organization needs to help employees foster relationships with one another in a natural setting. So for example, forcing everyone to go to the company holiday party isn't always effective. You can't just throw all your employees in one room and expect them to start developing these really great relationships with each other. In theory, this will reduce emotional exhaustion and increase personal accomplishment. Communication, good communication, clear communication channels is something that's repeated over and over and over in organizations, and it is very crucial. It's crucial that the organization clearly communicates what its mission and vision statements are, in addition to the executive committee, that guiding coalition, so to speak, has to model that. Unfortunately, these are things that companies put up on a wall and walk away from. And in order for these things to really be effective, they have to be modeled every day in the organization, and each employee has to understand how their specific job and skill set contributes to the mission, how they personally contribute to the success of the organization. Employee feedback is crucial because this is a lot of the communication that we see in organizations, particularly 360 communication with your supervisor, colleagues, and subordinates. And appreciative inquiry fits into this as well. So in a performance development plan, yes, you need to identify areas that the employee needs to develop. You also need to recognize what they're doing well, collaboratively come up with new goals, and also have time for appreciative inquiry. Employees need to feel like their opinion counts. They need to feel that if they say something, it will be heard and it will be taken into account. Again, expectations are crucial here, and sometimes these expectations aren't communicated and then employees don't really know what's expected. They're not doing their jobs effectively. Most likely they get punished in some way for that, and that causes engagement to go down. And clear communication about company policy and administration. Unfortunately, in large organizations, when something is disseminated top-down, by the time it gets down to the line worker, so to speak, it's like a game of telephone, and they actually have no idea what was originally communicated. Trust is crucial in an organization. You need to trust the people you work with, particularly when your health or safety depends on the well-functioning of other people. You also need to feel like your fellow employees are committed to doing good work. If I feel like my colleagues aren't committed to their work, it's going to make it harder for me to feel committed to mine. And nobody likes to feel like everything's on their shoulders. Again, security and safety is crucial. This satisfies our need for safety. If people are being harassed in the workplace, or they know that there's substance abuse going on in the workplace, they're not going to want to come to work if they don't feel safe. Salary is also important. Although nature of the work is very important, intrinsic motivation for work is very important. We're all there to earn a paycheck so we can live and support ourselves and our families. And people who don't feel like they're getting paid enough become very disgruntled very quickly. So we need to see fair compensation in addition to strong work ethic in the finance department. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years or so, we've seen a few companies who have been less than ethical, and people have lost their pensions due to, extreme amounts of embezzling going on in the organization. Enron is a really good example of that. So if you feel like you're getting ripped off by the people you work for, that's not going to do good things for the engagement. We also need to see a presence of corporate responsibility. And this is a great way that organizations can really try to align their values with the employee values. What's important to them, and how can the organization give back? That will also increase the number of employees who want to volunteer and contribute to that corporate responsibility. There also needs to be a balance of leadership and followership. We can't all be leaders, but we all want to feel like we're important and we matter. So again, that goes back to creating those good 360 relationships. It also fosters a sense of interdependence, which is very important, because if I feel like something I do is going to negatively affect 5 other people, I'm less likely to do that. I'm more likely to hold myself accountable and do my job because I don't want to harm anyone else. In looking at my data, I identified a few spectrum factors that could either be classified as risk factors or protective factors based on how they're utilized in the organization. We've already discussed the balance that needs to be struck between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Relationship with peers came up a lot, not only in the data that I looked at with regard to workplace motivators, but it's also mentioned in engagement and the coping surveys as well. We have a need to belong. We need someone to feel like they care about us. It's not a good feeling to show up to a company and feel like you don't exist. We also need to help employees understand that they need to develop these relationships and utilize them in the workplace, and that's an inherent protective factor. Now, one caution I'd like to throw out there is that we have to be careful not to label an atypical disposition as maladaptive. In other words, there are some people that don't want relationships with other people. They don't care. They want to sit by themselves and do their work, and they don't want to go to corporate functions, and they don't want to talk to anybody. And sometimes corporations label these people as not team players, or what's his or her problem? Why aren't they socializing? Some people just don't like to. And we've seen kind of a trend of that in clinical psychology, diagnosing people with a psychological disorder who really have absolutely no desire to be around other people. Now, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. So when you come across employees like that, it's important to remember that at a basic human level, we all have to have respect for one another. And if somebody doesn't follow the mainstream relationship building tendencies that most human beings do, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. And those individual differences need to be respected. Self-care was another spectrum factor that I identified. Now, this is a term that's thrown around a lot. Oh, you have to take care of yourself, make time for yourself. And when we're really overextended, this seems like kind of a sick joke because it's just one more thing that you have to plan for that you don't have time to do. Companies try to do this, try to foster this a little bit through something like a wellness benefit. I've even been forced to take vacation before, and when I'm sitting there at my house on my forced vacation, all I'm thinking about is all the work I have to do and how I would rather be at work being productive instead of sitting at home. You can't force people to take vacation because it will not have the psychological rehabilitation effect that it's designed to have. So, in other words, you have to understand, how does this employee recharge? And then you get into a whole other slew of factors. Myers-Briggs is something that's very frequently used in organizations to try to understand who people are and how they recharge. So, for example, introverts recharge by being alone, maybe reading a book, taking some quiet time. Extroverts recharge by being around other people, going out with friends and family. Physical health is crucial to self-care, and health psychology has really come into focus, really advocating for people to live healthy lifestyles so that they can extrapolate that healthy lifestyle into their overall functioning. So this, again, is on a spectrum. If you're engaging in a lot of maladaptive coping, like substance use, maladaptive cognitions, eating bad foods, not exercising, most likely that's going to impair your ability to function. On the other side of that is more of a healthy lifestyle. So organizations need to understand how they can contribute to that in the workplace. Again, this is modeling. You're modeling to employees how to take care of themselves. I've worked in organizations that provide yoga classes. They have a gym. And they don't require people to partake in these, but they're available. Emotional self-care is also very important. And with regard to coping, we're talking about cognitions. So emotional health is kind of this broad range. So what I've done is I've narrowed it down to talk specifically about coping mechanisms. And the primary one I'd like to discuss with regard to emotional health spectrum factor is maladaptive versus adaptive cognitions. Sometimes people have maladaptive cognitions and they don't realize that they're maladaptive. So again, executive coaching is really going to help identify what cognitions are maladaptive and then how you reframe those so that they become adaptive. Also, things like self-blame and denial don't positively contribute to emotional health as well. So we kind of have to separate that out and try to get those employees to go towards the positive end of that spectrum or continuum instead of the other side that's more maladaptive. Now, I understand that the organization cannot just change people like that. The only thing they can do is model these things in the organization, but really when an employee goes home every day, it's up to them on how they're going to cope with their own lives. But if this is modeled in the organization, it's just one more strategy that they can use to try to help their employees. Areas for future research. I'd like to do future research or see future research done in looking at the relationships with recipients of care. This was feedback that I received from a lot of people who took my survey saying, you know, the relationship that we have with our patients or our clients is also very important. We get a lot of either positive or negative benefits from that, particularly in the medical field. So that's kind of a fourth element aside from supervisor, colleague, and subordinates. I'd also like to do more research in this workplace motivator theory. I think it's important to really tailor this to a specific organization and specifically define job categories as they apply to that organization. What I found was that my categories didn't fit as well as I would have liked them to across my participant sample. And so I think an area for future research, you really have to understand the industry, go into the company, find out what's actually going to fit, because that's the only way you can extrapolate or apply the information. And finally, look at generational differences in the workplace. There are a lot of different generations working in the workplace right now. And do things like which generation you belong to affect your level of burnout, affect your type of coping, affect your engagement, and affect what you are motivated by. I've heard several people say to me, I have a job, I can pay my bills, and that's all I need. And then I've had other people say, the nature of the work is very important to me. I need to feel passionate about what I do. And money is kind of this secondary objective just so they can pay their bills and live in our society. So in conclusion, the overarching goal of my study was to develop a model that will show organizations how to foster autonomous individual resiliency at a micro level, and that will inherently foster corporate or company culture resiliency on a macro level. It's important to note that all of these factors that we've talked about are in flux. Businesses are dynamic, and so alignment is always in flux as well. These are just the references I used, primarily where I got permission to use the assessments. I'd like to open the floor for questions, if anyone has any. Mm-hmm.
What was the most surprising finding in your research? Like the thing that was the most divergent from the traditional wisdom of organizational behavior?
I would say the most surprising finding that I noted was in the workplace motivators. I thought it was very curious that, let me find the slide here, that nature of the work showed up as number one for both categories. I hypothesized that the workplace motivators would be drastically different based on employees who had chosen a specific career path and had gone into that career path, aka the medical and mental health caregivers, and the administrative and supporting roles. What I found was that, in fact, although the order differs somewhat, they're relatively similar. I was encouraged to find that nature of the work was number one because it's more of an intrinsic motivator, and I think that's good news for companies because it means that they can capitalize on that instead of having to rely so heavily on extrinsic motivators. But you know, I thought that salary would come up number one under administrative and supporting role. And it was, you know, definitely further down the line in both groups. I'm also currently working with an illustrator to develop a model that visually shows the overlap, because I feel like showing 6 or 7 slides really doesn't do it justice. You have to illustrate the overlap, and that's how people will understand, okay, these strategies, this is how they work. This is what we're actually trying to do in employees and help them. And then you can see, by trying to pursue this strategy, I'm helping the employee become more engaged in these specific ways, cope more adaptively in these specific ways. And this is the effect it will have on their burnout. Now, burnout isn't 100% preventable. You know, regardless of what you do, at some point, most employees will become burned out. So it's more of a continuum factor of how the organization can help prevent and slow the process of burnout than prevent it altogether. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
And that comes back to bite the organization. So I was curious whether that came up, you know, throughout your study, and whether, you know, moving into some kind of training development process for managers looking at resiliency within the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you. I noticed I didn't do that with your question. He's asking, what do you do about that trap where someone is effective in their own organization and they tend to get promoted into managerial positions, just climb that, you know, cliche corporate ladder, and then they're really not all that effective? And unfortunately, we tend to see that a lot in organizations. Like, I have this manager, but he does not like working with people, or she does not like working with people, so why are they in this position? And that's really the responsibility of the organization. I think it's the organization's responsibility to assess goodness of fit. That's crucial in making sure that people do what they do best. So if someone is very effective in their position, let's say they are a really good engineer. I've seen this happen in a lot of IT software development firms. You have engineers that are very good at writing code. They're stars. And they say, okay, we're going to promote you to project manager. And then they get in that role, and they don't want to hold meetings. They don't want to talk to other people. They want to write code. They're getting paid more money, but it's a poor goodness of fit. Sometimes an employee has an idea of where they'd like to go, and it's the organization's responsibility to implement executive coaching, have them sit down with a coach and say, where do you want to go, and assess the skills. Do you think you'll be effective in that position? Sometimes the company has to say, I don't think you'll be effective in that position. We think your talents would be better suited over here. So that's how you can prevent what you're talking about. Unfortunately, as a consultant, you tend to walk into organizations sometimes and you see poor goodness of fit, but they're already in their position. So you can't demote them and say, yeah, we're taking you out of this position. In my experience, what's most effective in that situation is a lateral transfer, if you can find one. Put them someplace else that doesn't decrease their pay grade, because if you start paying them less money, they're going to become very disgruntled and their engagement will become less in the organization. And goodness of fit is crucial. You have to make sure that that employee has intrinsic motivation for that job and that they're well suited for that job. Sometimes an employee will start out effective in a certain position and then become less effective over time. And so you really have to be creative in terms of what kind of lateral or upward transfer can we make so that you can be more effective. I would really advocate for good practices in hiring, because this is where you can really avoid a situation like that. Place people in the jobs that they like and that is a good fit for them originally, and then you tend to decrease the number of employees who have poor goodness of fit in their positions. This is particularly detrimental to managerial staff. Relationship with your supervisor is the #1 predictor for employee engagement. So if your supervisor isn't really well adapted to be in that position, it's going to have a wide-ranging effect on all of his or her subordinates and most likely negatively affect their engagement over time. Did I answer your question?
Just continuing on with that, what are some of the best practices in terms of responsibility of assessing goodness of fit, so that, you have a number of organizations today that talk a lot about career management and employee-led career management, and then traditionally you've had almost a top-down effect for controlling the careers of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
What's the line of thinking today?
Best practices with regard to goodness of fit really start with one-on-one supervisor-subordinate relationships and/or executive coaching. We're starting to see companies hire more internal consultants and more internal coaches, who are usually the same person, to work on an individual basis with an employee. And I also advocate for good hiring practices. You want to know why that person wants to work for your company and what they want to do. Some people just want to come in, they want to do their job, get their paycheck, and leave. And they really don't have any need for advancement. So once you know that, then you can say, okay, well, how can we better motivate you? Usually those type of employees who are kind of in the revolving door positions respond best to extrinsic motivators. And then when you find employees who really strive for growth and see longevity with the company, you have a lot more to work with. And then they need to work one-on-one with a professional development coordinator, usually a supervisor or a coach, to say, okay, where do you want to go? What's your skill set? And are those two compatible? And sometimes you have to say, I don't think they are. I think we need to look at other areas that you could grow in that are more well-suited to what you want to do. Some employees come into an organization with an intent just to advance so that they can increase their pay grade. And the best practice, I believe, that's most crucial is one-on-one communication with a coach and an employee, or a supervisor and employee, to truly understand who that employee is, what motivates them, and how they see their role currently and in the future with that organization. And it does, the investment with the coach, executive coach, or supervisor. And that, again, goes back to goodness of fit. If you have a supervisor who doesn't like talking to people, who really doesn't care about employee development, then they're not going to be able to foster that type of relationship. So you have to make sure there's a goodness of fit with those two crucial key members of the organization first, before giving them the leeway to develop these personal relationships with their employees.
Psychologist who works for government, and at the moment, all this makes a lot of sense, and I would say 5 years ago we were really working hard on being able to do these sorts of things. But now we're working in an environment where we're merging organisations, where we've had to redeploy several hundred people so that they have jobs. Mm-hmm. The attitude from management, if I put this to them, is going to be, where's my magic wand? Mm-hmm. They're lucky to be employed. So what would you say are the key priorities in that sort of environment for managers?
Government is a whole different animal than private sector. And, particularly just with the layers of bureaucracy and the inflexible organizational structure.
We have managers that really want to do the right don't have the resources to do it with.
Exactly, exactly. And that's why a lot of organizations are trying to flatten their organizational structure so there's not so many people that you have to go through and get permission from. And I would agree with that, yeah, where's my magic wand? And this is a tall order for very large organizations to manage people on an individual level.
And it takes money. But in the absence of money, name 3 things that a manager could focus on that might make a difference.
In the situation that you were discussing. I think 3 things that a manager could do to be more effective within his or her role in a type of government setting is to really understand what motivates them, do some introspection, and determine if they are in a goodness of fit in their job. And identify, number 2, identify what they have control over. A lot of times employees want to see big change, they want to be instrumental in change, but they just can't. And unfortunately in government you can't just dissect the layers of authority without making everybody crazy. And so they have to identify what they are and how they can best move forward with that. Unfortunately, if they're not seeing change or they don't have the resources they need to make change, they can communicate that upward, go through the chain of command, and it's going to take perseverance to say over and over and over and over again, this is what I want, but you have to put it in those key magic terms that the executive committee wants to hear. How is this going to increase our revenue, decrease cycle time, increase customer retention, etc., and really work with the people that you have good relationships with, your colleagues, your subordinates, and try to, I would say, do more of a grassroots effort to instrument change. Another key component to seeing change in organizations is a sense of urgency. If people don't feel like there's a sense of urgency, change will not happen. And that comes from Cotter and John Cotter and his work on organizational change. So sometimes in government, exactly what you said, everybody should just be lucky to have a job. There's really no sense of urgency there to make people happier in their workplace. Exactly, and it's like, well, we are grateful, but we're also unhappy, and that's having negative consequences. And sometimes people, exactly, and so that's why I touched on trust in an organization is crucial. When you hear things like, well, you should just be grateful to have a job, you don't really trust the person who told you that, because now you feel like if you complain, you're going to be labeled as a problem maker or somebody, the squeaky wheel. And sometimes squeaky wheels get oil and sometimes they get laid off. So, people don't want to label themselves as a problem maker. It's just difficult in that situation, and that's why I asked that question in my demographic survey, was to get at, I don't want to incorrectly label employee disengagement as a lack of trust in the organization, because they're 2 separate concepts. Did I answer your question? Okay.
You mentioned at the beginning that you had chosen some people to do the sample or in whatever way, and then it kind of snowballed from there. So what was the draw? Why would people have wanted to participate in the survey?
My guess is that I was looking at developing autonomous resiliency in an organization. I think that's what really caught people. It's very important, but it's somewhat of a buzzword right now. And especially in the medical field, they've done a lot of work on burnout. So I knew that really wasn't going to draw people in, because they've probably already taken 3 or 4 surveys on burnout, as well as engagement. But I really feel like type of coping as it's applied in the workplace, and developing autonomous resiliency in employees, I think those are the 2 things that really resonated with people and wanted them to have their team take the survey. And I've had over half of my total 268 participants email me and ask for results. So I have a folder of over 100-something emails that I will have to respond to once I publish and disseminate that information.
So did you do any follow-on work then with the people who did the samples in terms of implementing some of the strategies that you came up with?
No, I did not. Because the data was collected electronically and anonymously, there's no follow-up. Now, I would, of course, offer my services to my contacts. I had several contacts across the United States that I said, okay, here's my link, send it out to who you know. And if they contacted me and said, hey, I've received permission, etc., then I could go in But I made sure to keep it anonymous because I wanted people to know that give me your honest response, and this will in no way get back to who you work for, or anyone will be able to identify you. And that's one of the advantages and disadvantages to using online data collection. Any other questions?
But on Maslach and Leiter, who I consider the top people in this field, they do identify people, all the demographics and that kind of thing, which I find very limiting because the corporation where I work, they don't want to hear anything that's going to make waves or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you don't get the data. So I'm wondering if you know anyone who's succeeded at that, of identifying departments and how they vary in their engagement and resilience and all these sorts of things.
I have not done specific research into he was asking about addressing organizational strategies across departments and what's effective. And I'm going to draw a clinical parallel here where the number one predictor of client change is client motivation in psychotherapy. And unfortunately, sometimes consultants are called in as lip service, and they're actually used as ammo against other leaders in the organization, where you're called in to, assess the situation, make your recommendations, and then the people who've hired you take that information, they kind of twist it up, they throw it back at the other people who suggested they hire a consultant and say, see, that didn't even do anything. It was a horrible idea to call those consultants in. So as a consultant, if you recognize that the people who've hired you, which is usually the executive committee, because those are the people that have control over the budget dollars, if they are not bought into that process, I walk away. And unfortunately, that lowers my engagement in the field because I really want to help people, and I want to go in there and give employees a voice and help align organizations. But if the people who've hired you have an agenda and they're not really looking to implement positive organizational change, nothing you do as a consultant will be effective because it has to continue after you leave. And going back to John Cotter's work, first you have to illustrate a sense of urgency, then you have to secure a guiding coalition, which is usually the people who hired you. Those are the people who are charged with modeling these things in the organization. And if they don't like you and they don't think you have anything useful to say, not only are they not going to model what you recommend, they're going to model the opposite. And
Well, the thing that moderates this, what you were just saying for me, is that I see organizations that want only the positive, which can be really good for the employees. They want the Myers-Briggs, they love that, the Stern-Steiner, all this sort of thing. They want things that are going to make them popular with the employees, that we're doing all these things to develop you. Just don't give us any questionnaires or any feedback or anything that suggests that the organization itself is doing anything wrong.
mm-hmm.
After all, we're doing all this good stuff. Why should we be getting hassled for it?
Mm-hmm. Your point is very well taken, that companies don't want to hear the grumblings. We only want to hear the good things. And unfortunately, that's a trend that has been established over the last 20 years of consultants coming in and giving employee satisfaction surveys and having things like comment boxes where only the disgruntled employees are going to fill those things out. So originally, we kind of started with this clean slate, so to speak, where we could come in and administer something like an employee attitude survey, and then all you get back year after year is what they're doing wrong, how much people don't like working there, how much everybody's screwing everything up, and if they would just promote me to president, I could just fix everything like that. And over time, it's really worn organizational leaders down, and they don't want to hear about it because they just hear it as complaining. That's how people get labeled as problem makers. Oh, this person's complaining again, go figure. And unfortunately, it is a difficult trend to overcome. That's why appreciative inquiry is very key. And we need that not only in the one-on-one communication that we see with the supervisor or the executive coach with the employee, but we also need to give positive things back to the organizational leaders. It's kind of like the sandwich. You're doing this really great, and we really appreciate it. However, if we could improve on this, that would be great as well. And then follow up with, and we really like working here because. And so Just like we need feedback in kind of that sandwich mode, organizational leaders need feedback that way as well, to feel that they are doing things for their employees and their employees recognize that and they're appreciative of that. At the same time, you always need to be striving to make your employees more well-suited for their position and keep them engaged. It's a dynamic process that is always going on. And I think a lot of organizational leaders think that, okay, if we have one holiday party and we do an employee of the month and we throw in a summer picnic, those are our 3 good things we're going to do. And that's it. And that's all we need to do year after year after year after year. When really it's a dynamic process. And that's why if you can know your employees on an individual level, you can better map out that dynamic process and cope with that in a more effective way. We are, I think, 5 minutes into break. So if there are any other questions, I'd be more than happy to talk to you personally. Otherwise, I'm going to conclude for now so everybody can go get a drink or use the bathroom. Or I think you still got time for a 2-function break.